I'm going to be talking to you about what we're doing today, why we're here today, and then after a quick break, you're going to have a chance to actually give us some of that information about where we're heading and what you think about our future and vision together. And he's going to go with.
I'm leaving. Bye.
Thank you, Greg. All right. So really then, he answered a bit of this question, but on behalf of the Standing Committee, which is an elected body, we're elected at our diocesan convention. One of the things we're charged with is to assist the bishop in fulfilling his letter of agreement. We actually are the ones who sign off on his letter of agreement. And then we also then administrate the mutual ministry review, which happens every year that's in his letter of agreement, which is a time where we reflect together on our shared ministry. And so when a bishop leaves, actually, the Standing Committee is in charge of that process, just the way if your congregation and your rector leaves, it is the vestry that is in charge of that process. And so for us, knowing what we know, it seemed that this would be a time that we actually need to stop and listen and think about how we've changed in the last 10 to 12 years. Because when we called Bishop Greg, I believe it was a good choice. But we aren't the same people we were 10 to 12 years ago, and neither is he. And so in many ways, we are at a crossroads together, which is both full of opportunity, but it could also be fraught with peril if we don't do it right. And so in the spirit of discernment, and here I mean that Christian practice of discernment, it would be better for us to engage in genuine discernment, which involves transparency. This is what the bishop was talking about, that feeling like you're cheating on your wife sort of thing. That rather than keep these questions or suppositions secret or pretend they're secret, because actually they're not secret. People have been coming up to Greg, as he's mentioned, for years saying, when are you leaving? Because there was a timeline, there was a clock, right? So we're going to be transparent about that. That's one of the benefits of this process. The other is real vulnerability. And so what we've asked Bishop Greg to do is actually open himself and his personal discernment question about whether he wants to stay here. We want to give him really good information, actually, about what he would be staying with, right? Because we're not the same people we were. And we're doing this because real discernment, real spiritual transformation requires listening. Listening to God and listening to the gathered body of Christ, which is this room right now. It's listening to one another. So, we're engaging in a year of listening. And this is actually just one component of that year of listening. So those 5 WalkAgain events that the bishop mentioned, this one here, we're going to be offering a web-based survey. I do want to note that an actual thing that we thought about and decided was that the information about who we are and who we want to be was important enough that just like with those rules for respect, we didn't want to do this anonymously. So there's a reason why we're having events, and even the survey, it will not be an anonymous survey. So when you participate, what my expectation is actually of all of us is that we say things that we're willing to stand behind. Okay? That's a thing about being authentic and true and vulnerable. So our plan is actually that the bishop is going to go away on sabbatical in July, and he'll be back right before convention, actually just a couple days before convention. And so what we're planning is that our convention theme is actually going to use some of this information that we've gathered, our reflections, our prayers, so that we can actually come back together, having prayed and thought about these questions for a few months over the summer, and then think together about what just happened. And that will all culminate in, after the sabbatical and shared reflection, Bishop Greg will make a decision and announce his intention by the end of the year. Now notice that ultimately the bishop decides, right? So the same rules apply that if we actually really wanted him to leave and he didn't want to go, we would have to do all that nasty canonical stuff. That's why actually he is the one who decides. But his decision, and because I actually believe he is being genuine and honest about this, his decision will be greatly influenced by what we're excited about and how well that matches what he's excited about. And so that's why we're doing this year of listening. And this is the process that we're going to help guide you through today and through the rest of the year. Are there any questions about that before we move on to some learning component? Because there's some models and frameworks that might be helpful as we work through this. But are there any questions about that year and the timeline I laid out? Yes.
So, what will the bishop be doing on his sabbatical?
Oh, we should have asked that while he was here. There are some things. It's a pilgrimage-based sabbatical, so he's going to be doing study. He is a believer that a sabbatical is not a vacation. So he plans on, I believe, doing some work on formation, like creating some videos that offer some basic instruction in Episcopal Christianity, as well as he's planning pilgrimages. One of them is to a convention to Parrot Heads, but we're not paying for that part. That's Jimmy Buffett fans, if you didn't know. I didn't really know. He had to explain it to me. Another thing he's planning on doing is making a pilgrimage to a concentration camp. So there's kind of, and I don't remember if he's doing Camino again. He might be, I think, a light Camino. So he's planning on engaging in several pilgrimage events.
He's going to do part of the El Camino.
Yeah, he is going to do part. That's what I thought. So he is going to do part of the El Camino. So he's going to be doing some walking as well. And just as an aside, I promise you the standing committee has very carefully reviewed all of the parts that we're paying for. So you know that we're good stewards of your assessment dollars. So what I want to move into now is thinking about change. So when we talk about discernment, really it's a response to change. And there are certain processes spiritually that are helpful when we think about change. So I want to begin by talking to you about one of the saints of our tradition, Saint Benedict of Nursia. He was a monk, but actually first he was just a disillusioned young man of some means. He went to Rome to study, and he was really upset, disgusted, horrified by sort of the decadence he saw. It was a time of great political instability and concentration of wealth. He didn't like the feel of Rome at the time. And so he wandered off into the countryside to pray. He wanted to become a hermit, but he was so holy, so wise, that people continued to seek him out even as he stayed in his cave. So besides bringing them food, people would come and say, I want you to be my master, essentially. Be my abbot. They wanted to serve under him in a monastic community. So finally he relented. But it turned out young Benedict, or younger Benedict anyway, was not a great abbot. In fact, as our stories of saints, they're called hagiographies. They're not exactly historical scientific documentaries, I'll say it like that. There's some magical and spiritual parts to them, so you'll take this for what it is, but this is in the hagiography. So a thing about the legend of Benedict is that at least 2 times his monks tried to murder him. First by poisoning his bread, and then by poisoning his wine. And both times there was a miraculous intervention, like a bird swooped in, ate the bread, then fall dead, and he realized it was poisoned. But he figured out at some point the common denominator was him. And so he started to wonder about this, and he developed what we call the rule, the Benedictine Rule. And it's actually meant as a rule for monks to be a gentle one that is generous to the monks. Now to us it might not seem particularly generous to wake up every 3 hours and pray. That is a thing they did, so they prayed 8 times a day. But there are other elements of this rule that are actually about maintaining a rhythm to our common life, which we've actually retained. Our prayer book keeps that pattern of daily prayer. We don't do it 8 times a day, but we've retained that. And it's about balance. So not being too far about your ego, but not being too far in your head, not being too much, focusing on work too much or works, but also focusing on prayer and faith. And so Benedict then anchored this rule in 3 elements. And the first one is obedience. Now, when I say obedience, most of us go, oh, that doesn't sound great. We're not always an obedient people. Well, really, most people aren't if you read the Bible. But in this case, we don't mean blind conformity when we say obedience. What we mean is listening to God and one another. And particularly in the context of Christian community, listening to God and one another in structured ways, this is actually a structured listening opportunity, right? We're framing a conversation, we're asking questions that are somewhat open-ended, and then we're just listening in the hopes that that will transform us or open us to transformation and readiness to do the next thing that God is calling us to do. The next part of this rule is termed by Esther de Waal as conversion of life. And this is both an openness to the new way of being that God is calling us into and beginning to live out that transformed life. Right? So it's not enough to hear God, you actually have to act. You have to say, here I am, I'll go where you send me. So conversion of life is about that. But we can't spend all of our energy doing. Will actually be poured out like a vessel of water, right? You can pour it out and there's nothing left. And in order to be re-energized, refilled with God's Spirit, we engage in practices of stability. And by this, I don't mean stasis. I don't mean keeping things the same. In this type of spirituality, stability means recognizing and appreciating God's presence wherever we are. So Benedict thought about this way. He was very concerned about monks he called gyrovagues. It's just a great word. Ever since I've learned it, I want to find reasons to say it. But a gyrovague was what he called a monk that came to a monastery and was all in. This is the best monastery ever. I'm going to be on every work crew. I'm going to do all the prayers. And after a little bit of time with the community, started to say, this isn't that great. I bet that monastery over there is much better. Someone who is unable to see and appreciate God's presence where they are. That's the problem of the gyrovague. And so for us, we can think of stability as a way to reconnect to the goodness and grace that God is giving us right now in the place that we are. Gratitude, appreciation. So there are some other ways we can understand change in our church. So that's a particularly spiritual way. But another change process that many of us in this diocese engage in is actually a process of mutual ministry. Has anyone ever heard this phrase, mutual ministry? Right. And maybe even you might have participated in something called a mutual ministry review. Right, which is not a performance evaluation. So annually we do a mutual ministry review with our bishop, and it is not a you stink or you're great. That's not the purpose of the review. Instead, it's to ask some very specific questions about how we're living together. But this is the mutual ministry process. You're going to be surprised at how familiar it looks. It begins with goal generation. So actually, if you do this process every year in your congregation, a leadership team, like your vestry or bishop's committee, get together and they set goals for common life and work. So in my congregation, we do this about once a year. We set our goals. We actually did a big one a couple years ago, so we're still rolling with the same action plan and we're just checking in with it. But every year we have to re-up and say, these are the things we want to spend our energy, these are doing, and these are the things that we believe God is calling us to do. And then we do it, right? We prayerfully and flexibly carry out work to accomplish the mission and goals set by the community. So we don't do this work without grace. We don't do this work out of a sense of we need to make money or have more people. We do this work pastorally and prayerfully. And then we gather again. And we evaluate specifically how well we resource one another for ministry and work together to accomplish the goals. Notice that's not, did you do a great job or not? This is about us working together and how well we got each other ready to work together. So that's what's called the mutual ministry process. So then, you might have noticed complementary makeup to these two cycles. And I would actually, I have this insight, which surprised me actually, because I've been working with this Benedictine life model for several years, and I worked with this one for several years, and it didn't occur to me until about last year. They're essentially they're using different words and different structures to talk about the same basic spiritual process. We listen to God and one another about what we need to do. We do it with an open spirit and heart. And then we reflect on it together, particularly with a sense of appreciation at God's work in us and in the world. And this is a way we can understand change. And it's why we've structured these events the way we did, and this year of listening the way we did. Because ministry functions in cycles. So I've described a mutual ministry cycle that's about a year long, right? We set a goal for the year, we live it out, and reflect on how it went, and then we do it again. But you could also think of this cycle as being a much longer cycle. Right? So you could think of this cycle as we engaged with a particular vision in 2007 when we called Bishop Greg, and we've done that ministry over about 10 years. Right? And it was about 2017 that we decided we needed to refine and update our vision. But what that would suggest is that we actually need to do some appreciation or reflection on who we are now, how God is at work now, so that we can be open to listening what God is calling us into together and what we need to do for the next 5 to 7 years. So there's 2 different cycles at work then. There's this big one that has to do with our leadership, right? So we called a leader and we've lived into one cycle together with Bishop Greg. And inside of that, there's been like 10 little cycles. But right now we're talking about this one. Are there any questions about the Benedictine model of spirituality and change that I taught, or this mutual ministry cycle? Reflections? Yeah. I'll come close and I'll repeat.
So under the mutual ministry review, one of the items was resource one another.
Yeah.
What exactly does that mean?
That's a great question. So I'm going to flip back so that we can get there. So under mutual ministry review, we're not doing a performance evaluation of a single individual. Instead, we're thinking about how the organization worked to support people doing the work of the goals. And so one of the things is like the interpersonal and skills-based doing, right? And the other part is, did you even have a fighting chance to do the job? I don't know if anybody has ever been in a job that just was ridiculous and didn't make sense. Like the organization created a job to solve a problem, but you didn't get to do any of the things you said you were going to do, or that they said you were going to do, right? That's a lack of resourcing. Another way people are sometimes under-resourced is we say, we have this really important job for you to do, but you have like $5. Throw a party. Right? That's not adequately resourcing someone. And so if someone who got $5 to throw a party didn't throw a fantastic party, one thing we could say, and maybe a more traditional organization that was profit-oriented, is you did a bad job. But in our model, we would say, hey, listen, this person did a great job of throwing a party for $5. We didn't do a great job of giving her the things she needed to throw a party. And so we as a diocese then, we have an interest in both of those questions. How well are we as congregations and individuals resourced, as well as how well is Bishop Greg being resourced for his ministry as our bishop? And that's not just about money, it's about a whole bunch of things. And then how well we work together to accomplish those goals we've set. Those are great questions. Any other questions? Well then, let's take a break. So we're going to be back here at 10:45. Woo!